Hey, I am not a journalist. I don't even play one on TV. No, I'm a highly opinionated commentator, and my views are not secret. I don't for one moment pretend to be objective. I just don't. I've got strong convictions that are my platform. Now, journalists are supposed to be unbiased and virtually agnostic in regard to politics. But you'll be very hard-pressed to find many of those folks these days. Look, real journalism is as dead as the last string of Disney movies and Bud Light beer, okay? Dead. Total. Most of those who claim to be journalists are as biased as me. And I've already said, I don't wear the striped shirt of a referee, but the team uniform of a constitutional, conservative, Christian, pro-life advocate. That's who I am. But despite my outspoken commentaries, I actually enjoy having civil conversations with people with whom I may not agree on a list of issues. Believe it or not, we really do try hard on this show to get people of various viewpoints to be our guests. There's hardly a week that goes by that we don't try to get a prominent Democrat to be on the show. And it's not to ambush them, not to berate them, or to confront them, but to genuinely treat them respectfully and graciously. Now, maybe it's the Southerner in me, but a guest should be treated like a guest, and a host ought to act with hospitality toward his or her guest. It's that simple. I'd have a lot more Democrats on this show if we could simply get them to agree to come. We've had some, and if you've ever seen those interviews, you know that they are given a very warm welcome, and we allow them to speak their minds without being interrupted or yelled at. My views are never threatened just because somebody sees the world differently than I do. If I believe what I say, and I say what I believe, hearing the positions of others, that doesn't intimidate me. It gives me an opportunity to test my beliefs in the face of respectful disagreement. That's America, how it's supposed to work. Well, tonight, my first guest on this show is a Democrat from one of the most storied names in American politics, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Now, I've been intrigued by his campaign for president and by the depth of his passion regarding issues. And I've also been intrigued by the irrational opposition that has risen up within his own party. Whether he and I agree on conclusions, that's for another time. But I sincerely welcome him tonight as someone I have come to respect for his having the courage of his convictions and the willingness to bring those convictions to you by way of this show. I'm not asking you to vote for him in the Democrat primary. That's entirely up to you. But I am asking that you give an ear to his story and his reasons for running for president of the United States. And I already know that our studio audience is going to join me in offering a very warm and heartfelt thanks that he respected us enough to come and sit for a conversation with me. Please welcome to our show for the first time, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Well, that's a nice welcome here for you.
Thank you all very much.
You know, these folks seem to like you better than some of the people in your own party. I'm amazed by...
Even my own family.
That's okay. My family doesn't like me much either, so I can relate to that. So what is it that the Democrat establishment is so afraid of with you?
Well, I think because I'm a threat to President Biden, and the DNC has rallied around the president. It's interesting because the DNC has a rule that they have to be neutral, and it's part of their charter. Mm-hmm. But they violated that during the Bernie Sanders election. And Bernie Sanders afterwards sued them, and the courts made a holding that even though they have that as part of their charter, that they don't need to pay attention to it. So they can choose favorites. So this election, they've been very open about disparaging my campaign. And they have allies in the mainstream media, at CNN, at NBC, ABC, CBS, and MSNBC. So in those, and the New York Times, et cetera. So in those media outlets, I don't get hearing in those outlets. And then I think also I'm a threat to other parts of the establishment, to the pharmaceutical cartel, to the military-industrial complex, to this corrupt collusion of state and corporate power that has put Wall Street's priorities ahead of the American middle class, and all of those, those entities that are really operating within the Beltway to strip mine the middle class of its wealth and its equity. And because I've spent 40 years suing those agencies, I think I'm probably more of a threat to them than any other candidate, because I understand how the agencies work and also how to unravel agency capture.
There are a lot of problems within the Republican Party, like they are in the Democrat Party, where it's all about protecting the institutions and the people who run them, rather than protecting the working people who stand on concrete floors all day and sweat through their socks. That's what I think is happening. People are listening to your message. It's kind of an old-fashioned message that your father and your uncle, that they taught. And it's almost like that today there are so many people in power that don't want to hear that message. Why?
Well, I mean, they're in power because they're part of that system. And, and particularly, I think, we're seeing more and more kind of the weaponization of the enforcement agencies, of CIA, of FBI, and the politicization of those agencies, which was really off limits and verboten in the past. And, my family's had a 60-year fistfight with the CIA. And my uncle, in fact, among the documents that they won't release illegally, they're withholding after his death, there's 4,000 documents that President Trump promised to release and then did not for some reason, that President Biden promised to release. And there, among those 4,000 documents is my uncle's plan, John Kennedy's plan, that was written by two of his closest aides, Dick Goodwin and Arthur Schlesinger, for reorganizing the CIA to make it so that it begins again to serve Americans' national security and the public interest, rather than, as you say, the institutional interests of that agency and the mercantile interests of, certain industries, the pharmaceutical and oil industry. And I think that is a real threat to, some of these entities inside the Beltway.
You have done something that even Kamala Harris, the vice president, who was supposed to be in charge of the border, really hasn't done. You went down to the border and looked at it firsthand. What did you see when you were there? What needs to be done as you see it?
I was shocked by what I saw. And actually, Governor, took me 3 days to actually absorb what I was looking at. And first of all, I arrived in Yuma, and there's a gap in the wall there. And I arrived in Yuma at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I watched, over the next 2 hours, I watched 300 people come through. I thought I would see a lot of people from Latin America and Central America. But the first group of 110 were all African. They were from young men from West Africa. And I was not able to talk to them because they were already being processed by the Border Patrol. The second group that came through, there was 2 more busloads. The buses are owned by the Mexican drug cartels. There were 55 on each bus, and I interviewed each one of them. They were from Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, China, Tibet, and India. So there was only 2 families the whole night from Latin America, and they were the only 2 families who had legitimate asylum claims.
And these were families, but most of what you saw were mostly young men, right?
Most of them were not families. Most of them were individuals, and they were adults. And then, I mean, the weird thing that's happened was once they come through,
Yeah.
the Border Patrol no longer patrols the border. They've become essentially travel agents. Their work, everybody now, the Mexican drug cartels are now running U.S. immigration policy. 7 million, there's no effort to stop them. They come in, they're fingerprinted. If they have a criminal record, they're diverted. But if they don't, they're put on a plane within 4 days to any destination that they want in the United States. If they do not have money for a plane ticket, then the Border Patrol buys them a plane ticket. And they're landing now then, on cities like New York, 100,000 have landed in New York. They're crushing the social safety net. And the people who believe that this is the right thing from a humanitarian point of view, it's a humanitarian crisis. It's a disaster. It's a catastrophe. The people who are coming through are given a court date 7 years in the future.
7 years.
So then they're here for 7 years, but they are in a limbo status. Well, they can't legally work. And so they become targeted by unscrupulous employers who hire them usually on construction sites for $5 or $6 an hour, which they can't live, so they're still sleeping on the sidewalk. And they're dampening the pay for American construction workers, unionized construction workers. But plus, they're absolutely devastating the social safety net. In New York, they're now putting them in encampments on Roosevelt Island, which is where all the sporting fields for New York middle schools and elementary schools and high schools are. New York kids who were locked in during the COVID epidemic for 3 years, and a lot of these are kids that are potentially scholarship trajectory kids, could not play their sports for 2 years. Finally, they're on the sporting fields. Now those sporting fields, Mayor Adams is putting migratory encampments there so they can't play sports anymore. This is not good for anybody in the country. There are 7 million that have come across over the past 3 years. And, it's crushing our country. I worked with Cesar Chavez during the last 20 years of his life on pesticide issues.
Yeah.
He was a very close ally of my father's. But the other big issue for him during that part of his life was closing the border, because he saw what it was doing to the migration was doing to reduce the leverage of legitimate farm workers to demand decent pay and wages and conditions in their employment. This isn't good for anybody. And another thing is, everybody who came across the border that night knew exactly what was going to happen. The Mexican drug cartels are advertising on TikTok and on YouTube all over the world and saying, you give us $10,000 or $15,000 and we will get you in the United States. And here's what you do. You get a plane to Mexico City, then we will get you a visa. You then are put on a domestic flight inside Mexico to Mexicali. We will then pick you up at the airport. There's a parking lot there filled with buses that are owned by the cartels. And they drive them up to the border, which we saw, and 55 people get off each bus and cross the border, and nobody's ever stopped. There's 9 Border Patrol agents that have committed suicide during the last year because they're utterly demoralized.
We've talked about the fact that many people in your own party have tried to shut you down, but you recently had to sue both Google and YouTube because they were shutting you down, trying to take your voice away from things you wanted to talk about. It's frightening to me that a judge decided, no, they're private companies, and even though they basically operate like monopolies, they just tell you that you can't talk. We don't want to hear what you have to say. That's disturbing from a First Amendment standpoint.
Well, we do have one of our cases which has yielded a decision by Judge Doty, a 155-page decision. We brought that case. It's called Kennedy versus Biden, and then the Attorney Generals of Louisiana and Republican Attorney General of Louisiana and Missouri brought a companion case, and now they've been merged. And this very, really good decision by a judge in Louisiana has now ordered the White House to have no more contact with Google and with or with any of the or Facebook or any of the social media sites. My name is all over that lawsuit because I was the first person. I was censored by both administrations at government orders. And, you know, a private company like Google or YouTube have the right to censor you. And it's not right because they occupy the public square. They are the public square. But the law is pretty clear that, you know, they're like a publisher. They can publish you for no reason or any reason. But they cannot censor you if the government ordered them to do it.
Yeah.
And what this decision Judge Doty said is that, yeah, the government was ordering within 37 hours of President Biden taking the oath of office, the White House was ordering Google, ordering Twitter and Facebook to remove my accounts. And it wasn't because I was spreading misinformation, which people say, but you know, my fact-checking operation is probably more robust than any news organization in this country. I have 350 PhD scientists and MD physicians who are on our medical advisory board. Oh, I don't publish anything that is not peer-reviewed, or is not sourced to a peer-reviewed publication or government database. They had to, in fact, internally invent a new category. So they have misinformation, disinformation. For me, they used a word called malinformation, and that means misinformation that is true, but is nonetheless inconvenient for the government, and the government wants to be taken down.
That is disturbing.
And what they were doing was they were threatening Google or threatening Twitter to remove their Section 230 immunity. So these companies, these social media companies, rely on a section called Section 230 of the Communications Act. And Section 2, you know, normally, if you publish a defamatory article about me in the New York Times, an editorial, I can sue you, but I can also sue the New York Times. So Congress passed a law that applies to the social media site that says that if somebody publishes a defamatory post on those sites, that the site, the social media site, is immune. You can't sue them. And that makes sense because otherwise they would have to vet with attorneys every single post, and it would be the end of their business model. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg said it's existential to us. If we don't have that Section 230 protection, we're out of business overnight. And so what the White House was telling Twitter and Facebook is, if you don't censor Kennedy, that we will take away your Section 230 immunity. And so, and they were not only censoring me, they were censoring a lot of people. And they weren't, you know, it wasn't as public health information. They were censoring information about the Ukraine war.
Yeah.
They were at one case, they censored a satirical article about President Biden and his wife that had nothing to do with any issue. It was just, you know, it was a satire. And so, you know, when the ruler can silence, when the government can silence its critic, it has license for any atrocity.
It's disturbing. And I wanted to mention that you were at a congressional hearing. It was one of the most compelling I've ever seen. It was on censorship. You were there to talk about censorship, and the whole thing was people from the Democrat Party in Congress were doing everything they could to censor you in the context of a hearing regarding censorship.
Yeah, that was ironic.
Beyond ironic. It was almost comical. It was so bizarre.
Yeah, it was. And they, you know, not only did 100 Congress people signed a petition to make sure that I couldn't talk at a censorship hearing, but then when I got there, they made a motion to go into executive session so the public couldn't hear me when I testified. And they voted, you know, on along party lines, 8-10. To censor, but you know, the 10 Republicans voted to let me speak, and the 8 Democrats voted to censor me. But then they would ask me questions and they would not permit me to answer, which you can do in Congress. And, you know, which was another sort of surreal situation. But luckily I was allowed to talk. And, you know, it was, as you said, people have told me that in 40 or 50 years of observing congressional hearings, that was the strangest one that they have ever seen.
It was, in fact. I want to tell you, I appreciate the convictions that you have come, particularly the fight for the middle class, fight for workers. I want to say thank you for coming tonight. It is an honor to have you. And I think you're striking a nerve. I know your numbers are shooting up in places like South Carolina, and that scares the daylights out of some of the people who don't want to see your message out. We're delighted to be able to have this time to visit with you. I hope we get to do it again. But thank you. Bobby, thank you for coming and sharing with us and for being with us. It's been an honor. I hope that you will follow Mr. Kennedy on social media. We've got all of his links for you at Huckabee.tv, and you can go directly to his campaign, get his message, and find out what it is he's saying that has some people really, really nervous in Washington. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I hope you will now. The button is just below this video, and there's a little bell next to it. If you click on those, YouTube will reluctantly start letting you know when we've got a new video uploaded.